So our next speaker is Dr. Shivkumar Kalyanaraman. Shiv is currently the Chief Technology Officer, Energy and Mobility at Microsoft R&D India, and for Azure Global. Previously, he was with GE as their Executive General Manager, and where he looked at e-mobility and digital AI initiatives. And prior to that, he was also at IBM Research India as Chief Scientist. And I know him, of course, from his earlier academic career. He was a full professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute at Troy, New York. And he is, of course, an alumnus of IIT Madras, and later on he got his MS and PhD from Ohio State. He also has a MBA from RPI. So he is a fellow of IEEE, fellow of INAE, and AACM Distinguished Scientist. So it's a pleasure to have him here. And
Okay, so this will be a little bit lighter than some of the talks you heard, but hopefully it'll give you more of an industry perspective of a lot of changes happening in India, especially. So I'll probably be talking about electric mobility, which is at an infancy in India, and how various other trends in digital, fintech, and clean tech are intersecting with it. And how, and also I'll give you a little bit of a global perspective as well, what's going on, and what is necessary to unlock or make the space go faster, right? So, or grow faster. So that's one of the areas I'm looking at, along with the energy and mobility. So there are connections between the clean energy side and clean mobility side. Okay, so the broader arc of what is happening is just like there was a transition from the telecom or telephone networks of the past, which some of our younger audience may not even be familiar with, to the packet switch networks or the internet, where you moved away from a fully integrated real-time network that was sort of like a real-time supply chain, to a more decentralized autonomous systems-based network called the internet. So we are seeing a similar shift in the energy network, where there is sort of overlay digitization and decentralization of controls and sort of capabilities coming in, like solar, electric vehicles, microgrids, data centers. All of these are becoming flexible supply, flexible demand, and also low carbon or no carbon sources, right? So the other additional trend is the drive towards decarbonization, which links to climate change. So this is a broader thing that is happening. Of course, electricity is not the same as bits or packets. So there are obvious differences, but there are many analogies. Similarly, just like a bunch of bits were put together in a packet with a header, and you could then store them in a router and so on. Similarly, energy storage is showing up in small ways across the sort of electricity network, and that even small amounts of energy storage relative to the size of the grid can make huge difference. So that's the big transition that's going on in the space. So how is it relevant to what we are talking about here? So as I told you earlier, distributed energy and enterprise choices, like at a retailer like Walmart or IKEA, those are data centers like Microsoft or Google and so on, right? So we buy a lot of renewable energy. So that's one of the driver. And on-site, many of these have combination of electric vehicles, storage, and renewable energy, etc. So that's one side of the puzzle. The other side is in the power grids. There's a regulated portion for reliability. There is also an unregulated or less regulated portion for solar farms, wind farms, those sorts of areas, which is again more competitive and a lot more fast moving. And the third part we'll talk about a lot more today is electric mobility in general, transportation as a service, and how it interplays with electric charging infrastructure. Right, and this is disrupting the auto industry, and it's sort of overlapping to some extent with the power industry, and also a lot of it is driven by various other dimensions like logistics, finance, and e-commerce. Also, I'll talk about in a moment. So, one of the interesting common themes across all these areas is that when they look at solar, wind, or lithium-ion batteries and so on, they've been on a very steep cost drop over the last decade. And you can look at it as experience curves or learning curves. And as you have doubling of deployment, in addition to pure economies of scale, the manufacturers also figure out how to put these systems together or these elements together much more cheaply or more cost effectively, right? You learn how to build better solar panels, or you learn how to build better wind turbines and also lithium-ion batteries in terms of tuning the chemistries or managing the battery packs and things like that, right? So this has been incessant drop of almost 20% per doubling that is happening in most of these technologies. Okay, and this 20% is a very large number. Normally, technologies have between 10 to 15%, and compounding at 20%, 25% or more in case of solar as well, leads to tremendous drop in unit costs. Now let's look at what it means in terms of electric mobility. See, in solar, a few years or a decade back, people said solar was very, very costly. Now you start seeing at the large scale solar is appearing everywhere, and especially in many markets, distributed solar is also taking off very rapidly. So similarly, electric mobility, people are saying it's very, very, very costly. But because of the fundamental drop in the unit cost of the core elements, so this is like a new Moore's law in the space, right? So it's you will see dramatic reductions in cost, which will again drive deployment, which will again drive up further cost declines. So across the various markets, because of the angle of decarbonization and climate change, there is also huge government policies in various parts of the world. Some of it is driven by pollution. In India, there's also energy security. China was also trying to get control over both its pollution at its cities and its dependence on imports. In Europe, there's been a huge push in terms of response to climate change commitments. So there's government policies at multiple levels. Individual cities have been putting restrictions and saying that after 2030 or 2040, no more sort of petrol or diesel vehicle sales will be allowed. So this is again another driver, even though that 2030 seems 10 years away. If you buy a car in 2025, its depreciated value in 2030 will be close to zero because you cannot really drive it in the city, right? So what that is happening is it is lowering the depreciated values, and that is actually affecting the economics of the cars you buy today. So this market is projected to take off significantly by various commentators going forward. The other, as I said, technologically, there's a lot of learning happening, better integration, and also because of the scale across sectors, across the automotive sector, the IT sector, in terms of cell phone and battery and power electronics, there is a lot of cross industry learning that's also happening. And even areas like digital and AI, like I come from Microsoft, the application in these spaces, so the digitization movement to the cloud, the edge, and application of AI, IoT, these are also rapidly increasing. And of course, there are many disruptive new players. Some of you might have never heard of companies, some of the companies listed here. But of course, they are starting to make a huge impact. So Tesla is an example of a company which is now one of the largest automakers by market capitalization. Even though it's probably one of the smallest automakers in terms of number of units it has shipped. So other big automakers are also have made significant manufacturing investments. There's huge battery investments going on. So this leads to a virtuous cycle of electric vehicle growth, electric charging infrastructure growth. It's just 40 to 50% compound annual growth at this growth rate at this point. It's just huge growth. And at some point, the total cost of ownership, that is, if you take the capital expense and operating expense and sort of levelize it over a few years, like 4 or 5 years, it starts to have something called a break even, and the internal rates of return become positive. So this means that fleets suddenly get interested in sort of putting this together. So we will see a lot more adoption in terms of fleets of electric vehicles, just like we saw in large solar farms being operated by specialist combination of financiers and developers and so on, right? As you drive more miles, the cost per mile drops, and then again more vehicle miles traveled increase as well. So this is so the like a virtual cycle that we'll see. From the auto OEM perspective, these are big automakers, and their supply chain. They are starting to realize that this is one of a big opportunity for them to convert their businesses to be more digitally driven and software driven. So not only are they making widgets and cars or sort of powertrains and things like that, they are instrumenting it with IoT. They are sort of monitoring things in real time, and they can both control as well as observe what's going on in their specific component or the entire vehicle from so with a real-time telematics perspective or autonomous operations perspective, right? So you can think of this in 2 or 3 buckets. So connected vehicles, there are many use cases for this, and I'll talk about how this drives the changes in business models. Traditionally the automakers' business model is similar to how Gillette sells, razors and blades. So you sell the razor cheaply, and then you keep selling blades at a very expensive price points over the period of time. Or if you see how printers are sold, the printer appears to be cheap, but then the cartridges are costly over a period of time, right? So similarly, cars are sold at somewhat low margins at the sale point, and then the service costs as well as part supply are a significant source of revenue both for the dealer networks as well as the manufacturer. But when you go to electric vehicles, there's not that much maintenance to do, and also the electricity relative to the petrol costs and so on is low. So what that means is the ongoing after sales service is lower. So therefore what is important is not the activity to just keep things going, but digital services that can then link to, say, insurance or making sure that the asset is under good health, and then connecting it to finance, or bundling all of these things together and offering the whole experience as a service, right? So this is very similar to cloud computing and so on, where as the dynamics of the industry changed, as the computers themselves became fundamentally instrumented, the internet became a delivery vehicle. Now you could offer computing, you could take computers and software and put it together and sell computing as a service, or software as a service, etc. Right? So that's the same thing that's likely to happen in these areas. And since like cloud providers know how to do as a service things, some of us are feeling that we can help these industries. So the other dimension is, as e-mobility happens, again, you need to monitor components, and you could even offer tire as a service, battery as a service, and lease them, etc. Right? So we are starting to see many of these elements as showing up in new business models like battery swapping and so on. Right? I'll come to some of that in a little bit. And autonomous is the long-term frontier, especially in Western markets. Now, the other driver of electrification is also e-commerce, interestingly, both in major markets as well as some potentially markets like India. Because e-commerce requires, rather than you going and picking up your groceries or, buying stuff from a supermarket, you get it delivered, right? It could be delivered in bigger vans and trucks in the US and so on. Or it could be in smaller two-wheelers and three-wheelers, like it's shown here on the right-hand side top, in markets like India, right? Now, this means that these are going to be fleets of vehicles, and these fleets of vehicles, once the total cost of ownership, or called TCO, is lower than the total cost of ownership of a gas or a sort of petrol-driven vehicle, diesel-driven vehicle, the fleets will start switching over. And guess what? From 2019, the switchover has already happened in many markets, and is rapidly starting to occur in other markets. Right, so so you can see the graphs on the left that is driving this. So this means that there's going to be a lot of very interesting things happening. So if you look at it fundamentally from an energy efficiency perspective or energy cost perspective, which you can then combine together, to figure out what a cost per mile is. These are calculations I did for some fleets like Uber, Ola fleets, and some other commercial vehicle fleets, typically in US and Europe. But some of these lessons also hold true in India in percentage terms. You get 60 to 75% savings on an OPEX basis. So when your OPEX is dramatically lower by 75%, if your CapEx keeps coming down because of learning curves, it is just a matter of time before the entire industry is going to get disrupted. Okay, and this is starting to happen. And once it starts to happen, it will grow very, very fast. Coming to markets like India, the challenges are somewhat, some of the challenges are common, some of the challenges are different. So in India, we have a high cost of capital. That's primarily because India has a high inflation rate, because we're supply constrained in many areas. There's a lot of demand, there's less supply. That's one thing. And then there are many, many bottlenecks. Okay, our roads are a bottleneck. That's why you have traffic jams. You have other bottlenecks and so on. Or you have pricing power, which means, there are computational bottlenecks and so on. Or you can have risks, right? So your vehicles can break down, somebody can steal your vehicle, things like that, right? All of these lead to high cost of capital. Now, so the fundamental thing is, if you have high cost of capital, it means your interest rates are going to be high, or your leasing costs are going to be high. So the trick, one of the challenges is how do you arrange the elements so that you can lower the cost of capital and lower the risk. Fundamentally, you have to lower the risk, and that translates into a lower cost of capital. Then we all know about our road infrastructure state, and also because of the road infrastructure state and political aspects, the real estate costs are also high. And the distribution grids are often owned by states in most places, and that means political interference. You give power free for farmers, people steal power, so there's not enough. Financially, many of these distribution utilities are bleeding, and therefore not enough capex to fix things, and so on. And then we have externalities like pollution, carbon emissions, and energy security, like amount of oil imports. So these are the challenges in India. Some of these are common in other markets as well. But because of the high cost of capital, one of the interesting trends in India is that you might want to reduce the total amount of capital deployed per asset, right? So, for example, rather than having a large battery for a car, you could have a small battery for a scooter or a 2 or 3 wheeler. So we are seeing 2 and 3 wheelers take off because your size of battery you need to deploy is much smaller, right? And then the urbanization is growing rapidly, and the distances are small, speeds are lower. So these also fit very well with e-mobility characteristics. And of course, in India, actually, the digital infrastructure is growing much faster than the physical infrastructure, and innovation is fantastic in the areas like UPI, fintech, mobile, IoT. We all know about all of this. So I'll talk about some of the manifestations. And there's a huge potential for distributed solar, even though we have lots of very nasty challenges as well in that space. And I mentioned the adoption of e-commerce is also growing in urban spaces, and then broadening into the tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4 cities as well. So, Airtel and others have shown that prepaid telecom can take off, or per use services like whether Bounce, Yulu, all of these can take off, right? So, and the urban logistics sector, similar to whether it's FedEx and so on in the US, you have whether it's Unilever or others, or Swiggy, etc. They can deliver. So I think overall these bode well, and 2-wheelers, 3-wheelers, these are likely to lead the sector, and of course buses. So so we see the potential for a lot of magic, and enabled by also by software. So just to give a little bit of sense of what's going on, so there have been a number of exciting product announcements in 2-wheelers for personal e-mobility. And some of these are, since the capex is high, if you were to compare like for like with this vehicle, like you have Bajaj Chetak Electric or so, priced at 1 lakh, compared to a normal scooter you'll buy for 45,000 and so on. So there's a significant difference in capex. But if you look at total cost of ownership, it still may work out, but it's very hard for a consumer to make that choice. So things like leasing or subscription models are also starting to show up, and there are some real practical constraints or considerations to making it all work out. The other, and companies like Revolt and so on are launching, subscription-based electric bikes and so on, or modular aspects. So you can buy the bike and buy 1 or more battery packs. And so you can help control your costs. The other thing is Bounce and Ather, for example, have partnered on a peer-to-peer scooter sharing initiatives. And as you know, Ather was an IIT Madras based startup as well, which is doing very well. So the idea here is, how do you make as a service model take off? How do you help asset owners monetize or sort of get more value out of their what they have? And then how do you bundle all the pieces of the puzzle, whether it's insurance or sort of charging and so on, and provide all of this as a service, right? So each of them have been pioneering it in different ways going forward, right? So this is one thing we are seeing. Similarly, if you look at fleets, just like we had TVS mopeds, we are starting to see Yulu Miracle type mopeds, which are showing up, and the battery is swappable, and they are launched in a few cities in India, about 4 or 5 cities, and they're going to rapidly expand going forward. And that is a micro mobility option for about 5 to 7 kilometers catchment area for people for commuting or other users in the weekend and so on. So, many of you probably know many of these companies. Blue Smart Mobility is launched in Delhi with a focus on safety and electric mobility, and they're offering, cost per kilometers, sort of comparable or very close to what you can get with, regular diesel vehicles and so on. So we'll start seeing those systems growing, and lithium has been growing very rapidly. Another area is Sun Mobility and Ola Electric are pioneering vehicle swap technologies. One of the challenges in battery swapping is that the battery swap operator has to have very strong partnerships with the automotive maker, because the automotive maker should allow the battery to be swappable in the first place. Or they have to be able to design and either manufacture or get it manufacture their own vehicles. Okay, so for example, Ola Electric recently has purchased a Dutch company called Turgo, and they are in the process of setting up factories in India to sort of roll off scooters, which will allow you to have sort of battery swappable, and they're building a whole network of swap stations. And Magenta is sort of going the other way with solar and EV charging. So the distributed solar piece can be used to sort of supply the charging needs for this, or offset the charging needs, so that the sort of the argument of because I'm charging from the grid, even though I reduce pollution, I might be polluting through coal plants, goes away, right? So these are various things that are happening. And also we'll start seeing going forward multimodal transport, which I'll mention. So there's more vertical integration, joint ventures happening, and there is many of these problems require finance to be cracked, because some of these companies have all these assets on their balance sheets, which makes it very difficult for them to grow, because they have to keep raising capital. Okay, so there are many solutions to this, but it requires information technology and AI and ML to intermediate. Similarly, three-wheelers are taking off for logistics, as well as shared mobility. Of course, with COVID, we have to see how this is all going to play out. But as you can see, there are whether it's e-commerce, grocery delivery, food delivery, local services, shared auto, FMCG majors, and people even like Udan and so on, right? So there are many players who can drive this up. So it's just a matter of sort of getting all these ecosystems coming together and hitting some key price points to allow this, sort of essentially you need to ignite this to allow this area to take off. Similarly, buses, people don't realize that actually buses are the most penetrated, especially in China and so on, in terms of electric mobility. Even though it's larger, requires larger battery packs, but it can be driven completely from public procurement. And so that will be another area where India is actually slower in this area, but it will take off further. But lest we forget, even our rail systems and even the intercity as well as metro rail is all electric, right? So once it's electric, you can always supply it with solar and so on in terms of the source of energy. Okay, so coming to digital, I think one of the many small innovations which people don't see or realize, things like 2D barcodes, which everybody seems to know, or keyless entries, which is essentially a package of hardware and software, which combines what you see in your app with a secure entry. rather than having an analog key, or Bounce, for example, does vision-based scanning of a number plate to sort of book your ride and things like that. So many of these applications are born in the cloud and sort of integrate IoT analytics and so on. So, and as you add more and more services, like for example, as these services penetrate, they have good distribution. They can add a layer of location-based coupons, or sort of stitch together multiple modes, essentially integrate between a micromobility solution and public transportation, etc. So this will allow flexible monetization and flexible financing going forward. So one of the biggest areas where India can differentiate is our fintech ecosystem, because we have open stack in terms of UPI, Universal Payments Interface, and the India stack, and a number of very high-profile players like Paytm, Google, PhonePe, and so on, and the usage rates are skyrocketing in the space. So as there are more digital payments, what you can do is you can actually connect the dots between the rest of the financial ecosystem. For example, you can take an asset, you can tokenize it, offer it on blockchain, and you can get private investors to essentially buy and potentially trade these ledgers or tokenized assets. Intermediate, you can do other things like insurance, or provide safe user credits or rash user discredits. There are many other ways of securitizing assets and providing essentially streaming finance. So if you look at my articles, which are on LinkedIn, I have gone into this in some detail. So as you can imagine, many of these are digital problems, okay? And that's why I'm sitting in Microsoft, and we intend to connect some of these pieces together across the financial fintech and clean tech and sort of the mobility infrastructure. So finally, people say, "Hey, our grid is weak. Our discoms or the distribution networks are financially stressed. How's that going to work out?" I think one way you have to look at is that e-mobility is actually a new paying source of demand for distribution utilities. So one of the reasons the discoms are financially stressed is because people don't pay their bills, and of course the steel and other things, that's a different issue. So while they need to be restructured, this is actually a paying source of demand, and it's not a significantly high source of demand, but it can actually contribute very significantly to positive financial health of these discoms. The second is at places where you can add a bit of solar, like through canopies or other methods, like I showed you earlier, with like in metro tops or in other places where you can have large locations for EV charging. So you can have a combination of solar and storage and charging as well. So this means that the story of, hey, I'm using coal to charge this goes away, right? So at a local stage, you can you do that. And typically, some of the use cases like a combination of battery for UPS, diesel offset, and EV charging are very interesting use cases. So we'll see a lot more solutioning and essentially finance coming into these spaces going forward. And also in advanced markets, we can aggregate these distributed elements such as vehicle charging and sort of the solar, etc., to provide grid services of various kinds. So this is a very advanced topic in terms of ancillary services or demand response and demand elasticity. But this is starting to pop up in some markets like the UK and in some selected locations in the US and Europe at this point. But we know how to do it, and we can also do it in India. And these information flows can also be used and certified to claim carbon credits or flow of carbon from emission transmission, cap and trade type markets into these places. All right, so AI is pervasive in the space. So there's a lot of places where AI can be applied, as I said, in terms of each of these specific domains, as well as, but a broad space, I would say, is the cyber physical system loop in terms of the IoT sensing, edge-based AI, and also looking at fleet level learning and closing the loop across this, or AI to help connect the asset space and the finance space. So these are the broad spaces. I mean, the general problems are of visibility, trusted visibility, and sort of trusted controls, and trusted links to financing and monetization and these sorts of things. Okay, so let me pause here and take any quick questions. net, there's four spaces. It's a very unique, sort of set of ecosystems that are coming to and in other places, maybe 1, 2, or 3 might be coming together, but in India, all of these four are coming together.
Thank you, Shiv. So maybe one or two questions quickly. So one question is about e-waste from these batteries, and how do you safely dispose these off? Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that, and would that be a big issue?
Actually, it is not. There's already a number of players starting to show up in terms of the battery recycling industry, or using second use of batteries. You can take mobile batteries and then repurpose it into stationary batteries. There are many players already. It is all a matter of scale, right? So right now the industry is not at scale. So once you have it at scale, there's a lifetime of this for over several years, like a decade and so on, or 5 to 10 years, and then it has to go over to the second use. And after the second use, there is a question of you can recapture some of the fundamental materials like cobalt or lithium and so on, right? So they can be re-extracted. So this is not as significant an issue, but certainly people are thinking about it, and it's a matter of putting this together in scale.
Mm. And a related, threat that another person is bringing up is in terms of cyber crimes, and is all this digitization
Yeah.
safe?
Yeah, look, I think that's one of the reasons why you have to go with highly secure IoT systems in many of these spaces. And security is a double-edged sword. If you build it right and build it right from the beginning, it is very safe, because if you look at the banking and other transactions, you're using your mobile banking, you're using your other spaces. So when you do it right with hardware encryption and other spaces, or trusted IoT, dependable IoT, there are many sort of nuances on that. So that's why, from a platform perspective, it's important to work with safe platforms or safe IoT platforms, rather than if you just use quick and simple things. It's okay for proofs of concept, but if you want to grow something at India scale, and also at an affordable level, it's important to pick the right trusted and secure platforms. But look, secure is always going to be a game of going back and forth between the attackers and the systems designs to make it more secure and active security.
Great. But several people have requested you to share this material. I think I'll point them to your LinkedIn profile, where you have your detailed write-ups on these topics.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, thank you
Okay,
very much.
thank you.
And if you have
Mr.
time,
Sure.
there are a few other questions. If you have time, you can look at it and
Sure.
type your answers to that. So that concludes our first session. So now we will play a few of the poster videos, and you can also access the posters and the link that was shared earlier. I'll share it again.